You talked in the beginning about the three waves of feminism, and whenever you talk about the three waves, I feel that you're kind of referencing one particular place, like supposedly, for example, America. I'm interested in Irish feminism, and I wouldn't say that there's three waves here necessarily, and that the second wave began at a different time here as well. But my question is in relation to post-feminism, starting with the mediatisation of the backlash to feminism,
right.
Specifically the second wave feminism.
Yeah.
But post-feminism, I suppose here in Ireland, has become this historical moment in a capitalist consumerist society.
Right.
It's not necessarily a philosophical thinking. It's a moment.
As I understand post-feminism, it's a feminism that's willing to be critical about feminism. So in the way that post-structuralism is a response to the issues of structuralism, I read post-feminism as a response to the issues raised by feminism. And I kind of read the third wave as a post-feminism because it's interrogating the foundations of feminism. So it's avowedly feminist, but it's saying, okay, we take feminism as a source of critique in a way that post-structuralism, post-hyphen, isn't a rejection, it's an interrogation or negotiation of. That's why I read people like, I don't know, certainly Butler, Rosie Joshi, Elizabeth Gross, people like that as post-feminists in different ways. There's also a post-gendered movement or post-feminist movement which seems to aim at the eradication of gender. Now you might include that as a post-feminist movement, and you'd have someone like Judith Butler who has argued for a post-gendered society. There's lots of books that sort of beyond sex and gender, and that you might include that as a post-feminist. I think that's inherently wrong because I don't see how we could exist without gender. I mean, I don't understand what it would mean to be post-gendered, to be non-gendered at the moment from this current juncture. I don't think that's meaningful. So these arguments that we sort of move beyond gender, I think it misunderstands how gender works, and I think you just come back with Butler's idea that, look, gender is the truth of us, it defines the world. What could we conceptualise the world without gender? So I think that strand of post-feminism that is also problematic. So I don't know, the sort of post-feminism you're talking about, I don't think I have answered or talked about,
But that's
okay.
That's opening up another kind of discussion in itself. But
Yeah.
Anyone? Well, I guess I'm really interested in her relation to Foucault. I've read some Foucault and studied him to an extent in political theory modules here at Queen's, and also you bring up Nietzsche. She borrows a lot from Nietzsche. So this relates to that question about what's this better society? Is there a better society we're aiming for if we don't have a foundation from which to criticise the current situation? It comes to Foucault, as I recall, there was a big focus on power, on knowledge as not some absolute, like anti-enlightenment conception where knowledge was in fact power, that they were very closely tied together. I think he uses the term episteme to talk about a kind of a prevalent status of knowledge in a time. So if you could expand for me on possibly, I think you didn't go into it in as much detail, but possibly how Judith Butler starts to bring power to bear in the conception, like the idea of a thoroughgoing critique and where power comes into this, or if it's close to a kind of Foucault's conception of power. So I love that phrase there, woman as the target of critique, of continual critique. That's quite a powerful thing to read as someone that's not really well clued up in feminist, because you're thinking, surely the dichotomy is the other way around. Surely feminists be worrying about man and worrying about the patriarchy, but she seems to be so thoroughgoing, and there's almost an honesty there, and I wanted to know how that relates more tightly to kind of Foucault, for example.
Okay, so with Foucault you have the power of knowledge, and he has a book, Power of Spoken Knowledge, and the idea being that not two sides of the same coin, but effectively power is knowledge, knowledge is power, you can't really extricate the two. I think she takes that on pretty much, well, the way I read Butler is taking that on pretty much as Foucault cashes it out. There's always going to be the issue of, well, what is power? what we mean by it, how we when we talk about it. I think she connects it to the way that norms function to produce a subject, and again that's sort of straight up Foucault for me, that the subject is an effect of discourse, an effect of power. Power being the way that certain norms are enforced, the way that certain forms of behaviour are regulated and people normalised into particular patterns. So, I mean, you get this not just with gender, but something like rationality. I mean, we have insanity, we have insanity, and we connect, you know, this is this way of normalising ways of thought, ways of thinking, according to Foucault. So power is not just the ability to sort of construct knowledge, but also the way that norms function to produce subjects, which are obviously linked in the same way. So it goes all the way down to power. Don't know if that's
yeah, I didn't really ask a question, I just realised there on reflection, but I have been known to do this. But I wanted to tie this in then, because it seems to me like Judith Butler, in a pragmatic aspect, she'd still be well behind, you know, and she'd still be a part of that power. Feminist, for example, action, feminist activity, stuff that we might like think in our heads, like to do with like the suffragettes or the first wave, stuff like that's still going on in the world today, you know, right across the globe. And it seems to me that she, although we call this a third wave and a thoroughgoing critique, and these are kind of phrases that come up, that she would pragmatically still be very much behind this. This is an example of using power, of fighting for education for women in where they're still denied it today, for example in some parts of Africa. So it seems to me like all this said and done, all the theoretical stuff that we're working on, Foucault himself, as a practicing homosexual, he saw this as very much of an exercise of his power in the face of oppression. Of course, in the history of madness, he develops on how homosexuality was seen as madness for a long time, and this idea of the doer. So pragmatically, Judith Butler, she's providing still a theoretical basis for action. It's not like, wow, gender's not an absolute, or there's no stasis. It is indeed very active. It has great implications for the role of feminism in politics today. You know, wonder if you could comment on that. Like, it's still an empowering way of thinking.
Right.
You know, this action's very important. Certainly it is to Foucault, you know, in changing things.
I guess one of the things I really like from Foucault that I take is the idea of localised or strategic intervention. So we're not seeking one homogeneous universal theory that will explain everything. We have sites of resistance, and each site is going to require a different form of resistance or a different negotiation. So yeah, you have, and this is why I agree that the sort of historical account of three waves is problematic, because there are going to be instances or sites where the first wave and those sort of ideas are, you know, are particularly relevant, and there's going to be other places or other sites where a more deconstructive approach is going to be worthwhile. And I think it's not choosing in one or the other, but it's about, so you can kind of have them all in your, if you could talk about a toolkit, it's a horrible analogy, but all in your toolkit, you can break it out depending on, because look, the issues that maybe a woman in Africa is facing connected to female circumcision just doesn't map onto the issues that women here face or the issues that men face.
It's less subtle. It's right there. It's actual.
I wouldn't say less subtle, but it's, well, I mean, maybe it's a more explicit or easily identifiable form. Yes, you could probably argue that, but it's going to call for a different response. I mean, if you walk into, you know, if you go up to a woman in Africa who's about to be circumcised and you say, here's Butler, read this, will sort you out, that's not going to do a lot of good. It just isn't. It's not required. Like, it might do a little bit of good. I mean, it probably do a little bit of good. But it's
I just wanted to bring out that a lot of the talks about, like, a lot of this theoretical talk, some people might get, I think, lost a little bit. I might get lost a little bit and think, oh yes, this is all, look at the subtleties, look, am I a man, so on. But really, there's still a framework for action, right?
Yeah.
You know, there's still a framework for
yeah, well, maybe, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the big critiques of people accuse Butler of disquietism, that she doesn't really
that's what
give.
I'm kind of touching
Yeah,
on.
I think that's a fair point. It's certainly something that people have accused her of. It says, well, you just don't give any real basis for action. This is a lovely theoretical exercise here for pulling apart concepts of man and woman. But hey, I still think you can. I mean, it would take a long discussion, maybe catch up after, but I think you can get clear guide for action from her work. But
Right.
I possibly, having said that, I'm thinking example.
Could you say something about primary vulnerability? How she, you know, precarious life.
Right.
She talks about this sort of instigates a different mode of action, like not me doer behind my deed, goal orientated. It's more about paying attention to how I come into being at each and every action and why this matters and why sort of this kind of goal orientated form of agency isn't very responsive, and how she talks about, can you say something on that? Or?
She seems to be more and more, in recent months, turning to Levinas, or more explicitly. And so, I mean, Levinas's main idea is this notion of alterity, that he has concern over how representing or approaching or understanding others destroys their alterity because we define them in our terms. We approach them and say, I understand you as X, whereas actually that just reduces them to how we see the world. So it's sort of an elimination of alterity. And she thinks that sort of this, well that's Levinas's idea. I think she's sort of looking into that and she's worried about how we negotiate the other and alterity without broaching or sort of doing injustice to their otherness, to their sense of self. The bit that I think is more interesting, or that I'm looked into even more, is her Galilean reason, where how she uses recognition. No. So she, I think, running through her work is this interest in Hegel, right from the first book, and the notion of intersubjectivity. That is, we are fundamentally dependent upon the other for a sense of self. We are intersubjective beings, meaning we understand ourselves through being recognised by the other, and vice versa. You understand yourself through the recognition I give you. So it's a sort of co-foundational thing. This is Hegel's big idea, and recognition theorists developed it a lot. But because of that, we're fundamentally dependent upon each other and vulnerable to the way the other sees us. Because I need you to make sense of myself, but I can't control you. You may define me in ways I don't want, or in ways that clash with my sense of self. So we're very vulnerable in that sense. And again, this clashes with sort of Hobbesian account of stage nature of me, agent, going around imposing will on the world, doing what I want. And Hegel's model is really meant to do away with this and say, well, no, look, we have this prior relationship to the other that's sort of fundamentally unstable because all identity is, and uncontrollable because I can't control how you understand me and how you recognise me. So I think this notion of fundamentally is coming from that.
Yeah, and just on agency, could you say something about, she doesn't actually disallow agency, she just defines it differently.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. Some of her agency. So she seems to understand agency, as far as I can tell, as the alternative signification of acts, which is just to sort of perform things a little differently. I mean, this seems to be the big controversy. If you have any thoughts on this, I'd really like to know. Because the main thing I struggle with Butler is to identify a sufficient account of agency.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think I can turn it back on you? Because I don't know.
Just from Precarious Life, I think she's just sort of saying agency as me as doer, this is my deed kind of authority, I'm authoring my own self, is fundamentally not responsive to what's going on around me. And so instead of thinking of me as the doer, me as coming into being constantly through my deeds brings me back to a more responsive way of being, because I understand myself that each and every action I do is creating me. There is no me prior to my ongoing actions, and so that makes me more responsible because I can't kind of abrogate responsibility by saying, well, the goal is honourable and therefore the means don't really matter, kind of a thing. That's my understanding of it, and that kind of critiques of her saying she does away with the I. She doesn't actually, she just kind of puts a different slant on it, whereas she's saying the I is constantly coming into being.
Yeah, good. In fact, there's we contract that in the essay which says, I use the word I and I'm not afraid to use I, and I am I, evidently, but what are the conditions that allow that to be said? How is it we can understand that? What are the,
And how, and I think you touched on it like that, I define myself in terms of what I am not, and sort of, this is kind of inevitable, she says, but there are better and worse ways of differentiating myself from what I am not. And sort of maybe the most of worst is where I object that which I find unacceptable. So you have forms of objection of modes of being that aren't socially acceptable, and that this is that kind of a failure to realise your own contingency, that's what that necessarily results in. Any thoughts on that?
other than agreeing with everything you just said, that sounds plausible. Yeah. I guess my concern is where, not concern, but where sort of self-reflexivity comes into it, in that we're obviously self-reflective beings, reflect on our actions and choose our actions.
Yeah.
And there's that is the, surely seems a slightly more substantive account of an I, that is which is looking back and thinking about what it's want to do. This sort of second level that's not just an effective action, but actually can detach itself and think about those actions. I kind of want to have that in a theory because I think it's important, and I don't quite know how that would fit in with a strong formative account, like ontology based on formativity, because it's just the action. There is no doer, but evidently there is this sort of second level reflective doer.
There's only reflection, self-reflection to an extent. I mean, I think if you take the subject as sort of layered multiply, and that there's lots of the unconscious. I know you don't like psychoanalytic theory, but
there is an unconscious.
There is an unconscious, and there are our ways of being. We're not fully conscious of why we do what we do.
Yeah.
We are affected by all sorts of things that we have no idea that is affecting us. And therefore, I think she's trying to sort of challenge this idea that I am self-reflective and self-determining. Because when you take the unconscious and conscious self into account, I'm never fully self-reflective, and kind of conceiving myself as thus is actually, again, moving away from being responsive and being aware of, or trying to be constantly aware of what I'm doing and how I am enacting.
Yeah, good. I mean, because there's definitely, again, traditionally there's an assumption of self-transparency. And evidently we're not self-transparent, and I think it's good at pointing to how we're completely not self-transparent. And again, I think that's good, and I think that there's bits of Nietzsche, this idea that the self is a sort of play of forces, and there's just levels of forces acting on us, through us, and agency is sort of a multiple site of different forces. William Connolly's really good on this in his stuff, very Nietzschean, I think fits well. And the unconscious is there, and norms are there, and there's sort of this layers which collectively create the subject, and probably self-reflexivity is merely one force amongst a plethora, which really, again, dissolves that substantial agent subject of, yes.
Thanks very much. Question at the back there.
Hi, I was just wondering, you were talking about the psychoanalysis underpinnings, it kind of gives a universal underpinnings to Butler's theory. It's kind of like the hidden universal within her work that she takes from Hegel.
Yes.
And, well, sort of through Hegel, but I was thinking in terms of, with Hegel, it's the whole idea of you're both a subject and an object within, you're not one or other, there's a dialectic relationship there. And you were saying that you find that problematic, and I know Foucault found that deeply problematic and, didn't really embrace dialectics at all. In fact, he was very much against it, coming through being taught by Althusser. Marx, through Althusser, he sort of rejected dialectics. But I think partly towards the end, Foucault said that one of his big regrets was not actually embracing negativity. He said that in reference to the Frankfurt School and Adorno and stuff. I was wondering, it does seem that there's always that desire to have that universal value of a core, whether it's the Cartesian self or a psychoanalytic sort of death drive, or something there that grounds all that and allows you to break out of the sort of infinite loop of like knowledge power where it just continuously goes around. What is it that changes it? What is it that leads to history happening and change happening? And I think basically I'd say that that's just something we almost have to take as an a priori, that the assumption of the subject, albeit one that's very problematized. I was just wondering if you think, Marx's species being, which comes from Hegel, do you see much room for that?
Tempted to say no. I mean, I don't see why we need some universal explanatory tool that's going to do the job and say, right, ultimately it's about this at root. We just get down to the core, because that just seems to be overly reductive. I don't see the need for it in theory. I mean, it's not that we can't have these concepts that appear universal, but I think the project of politics is unmasking that which masquerades as universal. It's showing how it's not universal, and the silences and problems that generates by being posed as universal. Don't quite know how to answer your question beyond saying I think we can do politics without it, but I do think it's not to say we can't talk about apparent universals, but the project has to be to critique them and analyse them, rather than say, well, we can't really do away with them. I think we can, and I think people like Butler show us how we can. The key is, this is the point of contingent foundations. It's not saying there are no foundations, evidently there are, but it's showing how they're contingent and can be rethought.
Yeah, I think like the politics happens on a different level almost, so that, you know, it's a place of producing universalities, you know, where, you know, whether it's workers' movements, women's movement, it's a, you know, universalities are produced by historical situations. So when somebody says, you know, women, it's more of an oppositional label, you know, something you agree because you're fighting this, you know, it's not out prior to that. But I was sort of just thinking, you know, you said that you don't think you need it, but fundamentally in Butler's theory, she does fall back on it, and, you know, Foucault towards the end sort of thought, oh, I end up, you know, if without it, you end up just in that no explanation for change, no explanation for how history happens, and you're kind of always falling back in that dialectic relationship between object and subject.
Big questions, right?
So I think the key point that Butler wants to make is, and I think within feminism there's a trend away from, there has been a tendency to sort of look at something universal in terms of identity, that it's the identity that grounds the universality, and you've got a sort of development of this idea of coalition politics, which is people aren't linked necessarily by identity or shared identity, but perhaps something like a shared goal. Arguably something like the Occupy movement is an example of coalition politics, where people with disparate interests and disparate identities come together for a sort of temporary goal, which they and then disband again, and it's a much sort of impermanent sense of politics. That would be an example of sort of a pseudo-universal politics that's not grounded on identity, because she says it can never be grounded on identity, because identity is always problematic, and always unstable, and always exclusionary. So it may be that we can hold on to some temporary sort of universal, well, not even universal, but, you know, trans-European or something, or pseudo-global politics, but it's not founded in identity. And I think that's the main point Butler wants to get out, that feminism has tended to fall back on identity to do its politics. And she says, no, we can do feminist politics without falling back on identity. We can still create coalitions, but the key is what grounds it, what unites it, and it's other things, strategic purposes or agreed goals, or, you know, you might just think an injustice. And, you know, I think that's where I look at feminism, the basic claim seems to be, look, there is an injustice going on. Women are treated, you know, or a certain proportion of the population are, you know, getting a rough time. We can all agree that's a bad thing abstractly, so we should all be feminists. I mean, that's. But there's nothing about being woman that, you know, there's no necessary connection between women and feminism. I mean, it's just, look, this is a wrong. I can see that, you know, it's wrong to discriminate on the basis of race and want to correct that. That's a sort of an abstract right which grounds universal politics, but identity doesn't come into it. That's just, and I think we can do that. We can go down that route. We can have a moral theory that guides politics. But identity, I think that's not a good way of doing it. Don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, so
Sorry.
we'll get the last question here for now, and then we're going to continue discussion over Guinness and so on. We've only got 10 more minutes in the room. So we have a question from yourself there.
No, I don't have.
You don't have
I just
question?
really enjoyed it.
You're just kind of like,
This is my first ever philosophy
Right.
class or whatever, and I really enjoyed it.
Splendid.
And it coming from a man as well, I just find
is he a man though, or is
it
he a text? Is he just his actions?
Yeah, I don't know if it's indicative of philosophy in general. I wouldn't start going to philosophy
I
seminars.
found
and
it
all
very
that.
liberating. I have found this more liberating than, you know, anything that I've experienced before. I've found her whole, and I haven't read her yet.
Right.
Read anything about her, and I'm so looking
You're more
forward to it.
intrigued by Judith
Because-
Butler than
Yeah.
a lot of the stuff you've maybe heard of in the past and so on.
I've never, I mean, my daughter studied it, my son before, but not me, and I've really enjoyed it, and I will read everything, because I understand my own life totally with the way you explained it
Right.
in that form, and it's liberated me in a lot of respects, you know.
Good.
Very much so.
Make it all worthwhile.
The last question.
Well, I just wanted, just very quickly, if you wouldn't mind discussing sort of what you think about Butler's interpretation of like the body and that kind of thing, is because I'm studying Sylvia Plath, and you know, a lot of the second wave feminists have really like hyped her up as, you know, the poet du jour or whatever, but I want to look at her from a more like post-structuralist kind of way. I'm interested in reading her in context with Derrida, especially her later poems, looking at like the games she plays with language and movement from sounds, and you know, just that kind of thing. Platt's like later poems are the ones that I'm the most interested in, and the ones I'll just generally very quickly tell you. She's basically her last sort of section of poems. She sort of distances herself from the body a lot. She talks about, you know, lungs filled with, you know, just iron lungs and that kind of thing. Very, you know, reminiscent of Second World War and that kind of stuff. But for me, what interests me is that she looks down on herself almost. You know, there's a poem where she looks down on her own dead corpse and that kind of thing.
Effectively, I think she's saying, well, look, evidently there is a material body. Well, there's two elements to it, I think. There's, okay, evidently there is a material body, but actually that body has been shaped by day one from, according to norms. Like, you know, as a child, you know, you run around and climb trees.
Yeah.
If you're a guy, well, that does literally physically shape your body. So A, there's a tendency just to think that either that's a natural outcome of gender or something like that, because no, that the body is shaped through norms, literally physically, it is written on the body.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, you know, so A, that's sort of the first sort of intervention that discourse has on the body. And the second one is that we can never understand the body outside of discourse. We never get to the body, we never get the truth of the body. To say that is to say, okay, there is a body here, but A, how we experience it, well, that's going to be dictated through language, through the words we have to say, describe how we feel. That's basically just, I think, Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, sort of writ large. There is no private access here. That, you know, it's the words that give rise to how we understand ourselves. So that's what. So that's sort of second strike through the idea of the natural or true body. And the third one is, well, look, we have body parts, but what is the meaning of those? What is the value attached to those? And we inherently see bodies as valuable, as attractive as, you know, aesthetic objects, and we can't escape from that. We just look at a body and it's imbued with value.
Turn on them as well. Turn on our body. You know, just dehumanize ourselves from our bodies. That kind of, you know. Like in a negative way, do you know how, you know, we have parts of our bodies, but what if you're writing about the body in a grotesque way, you know, is that, you know, that's, I don't know, I'm interrupting you, I'm sorry.
No, there you go ahead. I mean, I don't know what it'd be like, what it would mean to purely detach or dehumanize yourself from a body is, I mean, it's always going to have a value attached to it. And I think her point is, well, look, you know, those values are just contingent and they're imposed, and how, you know, how we understand or see the body, well, that's always going to be in relation to certain desirable norms or undesirable norms.
But if we change our foundation, like in text, in literature, or whatever, you know, you kind of have the power to change your, like, framework even, you know, within the area that you're writing about something, you know, like, for Platt, she can change the foundations or the conceptions of what we, you know, think, like, of what the norms that are established came from, nearly, do you know what I mean? Like, she can change that, so, I don't know, I'm not maybe explaining it well, but for me, no, I've lost it. But, you know, it's you know, it's difficult for me to connect, to explain how, like, you know, if it's like a dystopia kind of, if it's not our reality, if it's like a different place that the norms of the bodies that she's talking about has come from, then how would Butler think about that, or does that, you know, even matter? Do you know,
Are you trying to say that the body has nothing to do with feminism or Plath, or?
No, I'm just in general, bodies
I'm somewhat familiar with some of Sylvia Plath's work, and I think it's very interesting. You never read it?
Sorry, no.
But in general, even like in a sci-fi world or something, you know,
So quite, from my understanding in some literary criticism regarding feminism and post-structural work, you know, describing the body and the poetry and women's descriptions, and you're talking about exactly when you're talking about like grotesque descriptions and so on. I'm sure this would tie into re-describing ourselves, re-understanding. It would be a part of certainly challenging maybe norms. So you're talking about the theoretical side. That's how in literature that could be cast out possibly.
So re-signifying the body.
But look, I would love to invite everyone to Bar 12 now.